I always knew that house was wrong. From the very first moment I parked the car in the driveway, an uneasy feeling tightened in my chest. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that this house represented a last-ditch attempt to save everything in my life that was falling apart. Anna and Sophia at first glance seemed happy with the move. Anna, with her empty smiles, did everything to appear normal, but I knew she blamed me. I blamed myself. Sophia, our 5-year-old daughter, was always distracted, wrapped up in her own world, something that had only intensified after the accident, after he died. The death of our son, Daniel, had shattered something between us, and what was left, even in that new house, were just fragments of a life that would never be the same. That first night, the house was completely silent. I tried to focus on the sound of the wind and the trees outside, but there was something else. A faint noise, almost imperceptible, echoing through the halls. Whispers. I thought it was just the house, maybe old, with the wood creaking from the cold night air. But something about those whispers unsettled me. A familiar tone, distant. I tried to ignore it. It was my mind playing tricks on me as usual. I was tired. The nightmares had already become frequent, but now in this house they seemed more vivid. I relived the accident in my mind with every awful detail. The sound of the car, the phone vibrating in my hand, and Daniel's high-pitched scream before the impact. But what I dreamed that night was different. I wasn't behind the wheel. Someone else was. A faceless shadow, covered in something dark. And somehow, I knew this wasn't just a dream. The next morning, waking up sweating and gasping for air, I heard it. A low laugh, coming from Sophia's room. I got up slowly and walked down the dark hallway to her room. The door was slightly ajar, a small crack through which I could hear better now. She was talking to someone. Her soft, cheerful voice filled the air with a disturbingly natural ease. "Sophia, who are you talking to?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She looked at me with a sweet, innocent smile. "With the boy, Daddy. He said he's going to show me where he hid." My heart stopped. "The boy? Who?" Anna tried to reassure me later, saying that Sophia was just creating an imaginary friend. Something common for children who have gone through trauma. I wanted to believe that. God knows how much I wanted to. But the whispers didn't stop. In the silence of the following nights, I heard that constant murmur, as if something was there, crawling through the walls, lurking in the darkness. Sophia's laughter now mixed with the sound of light footsteps, as if she wasn't alone. Then came the nightmares. They began blending into reality. I saw Daniel in every shadow, every reflection in the windows. His face stared back at me with an expression of anger. He was no longer my son. He was something darker, filled with resentment. One night, I woke from a particularly horrible nightmare where Daniel stood on the other side of the street, covered in blood, his face twisted into a wicked smile. The moment I opened my eyes, the room was freezing. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I knew he was there. I staggered to Sophia's room, something pulling me there. When I opened the door, my body froze. Sophia was sitting on her bed, her eyes fixed on a dark corner of the room. I couldn't see what was there, but I knew. I knew Daniel was there. "He's angry with you, Daddy," Sophia said in an eerily calm voice. "He wants you to say sorry." My legs buckled. Panic gripped me. I knew there was no way out. How do you apologize to someone who is dead? How do you make amends for the irreparable? In the days that followed, Daniel's presence became more oppressive. He was everywhere. I saw him in the shadows, heard his voice in the whispers around the house. With every step I took, I felt the weight of his judgment, as if he was watching, waiting. Until the day came when I could no longer ignore it. The guilt, the fear, it all blended together in an unbearable way. I woke in the middle of the night and heard Sophia's laughter once again. I went to her room, but the bed was empty. I rushed down the stairs, and that's when I saw him. Daniel was in the living room, or what was left of him. His body was pale, his eyes sunken and lifeless. He looked at me, no longer with sadness, but with pure hatred. "Why did you let me die?" His voice was cold, echoing through the walls of the house. "Why didn't you look at me?" I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't speak, I couldn't move. He took a step toward me, his figure growing taller, more menacing. "You will never be forgiven, Daddy. Never." Anna found me that morning, lying on the living room floor in a state of shock. She tried to understand, tried to comfort me, but how could anyone comprehend that? Today I'm here in this house, trapped in an endless cycle. Daniel never left. He's here with me, every day, every minute, and I know I deserve this. I deserve every second of this torment. Deep down, I think he just wants me to suffer, to feel what he felt, and I do, every damned day. I knew I should have blocked his number. I should have changed cities, jobs, lives, but deep down, part of me still believed this would pass, that Marcos would understand that it was over. I broke up with him 6 months ago. At first, he reacted calmly, almost with acceptance. It was only after that the messages started. At first, they were harmless. I hope you're doing well, or I miss you. But gradually, the tone shifted. From longing to frustration, from frustration to anger, and finally from anger to something I couldn't define. It was unsettling. Now, every time my phone vibrated, my stomach twisted. I knew it was him. And as always, it was a short, cold message. You think you can ignore me, but you can't escape me. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to throw my phone out the window and pretend he didn't exist. But it was no use. No matter how hard I tried to push him away, he always found a way to be near. I don't know when I started to feel like he was watching me. Maybe it was when I first saw him after the breakup, standing across the street with a vacant, lost look. Or maybe it was when I noticed his car slowly passing by my house for the 3rd time in a week. That night, however, was different. I was coming home from work later than usual. The bus was empty, the lights flickering sporadically as we passed through dimly lit streets. I looked out the window, and for a second, I thought I saw something, a familiar shadow, a figure standing at the corner. I tried to shake off the thought, convincing myself I was being paranoid. But when I got off at my stop, something felt wrong. The footsteps. I heard footsteps behind me. At first, they were distant, almost indistinguishable from the sounds of the city. But as I quickened my pace, they did the same. My heart raced. I could feel the fear crawling up my spine, every muscle in my body tense, ready to run. But where? My house was 2 blocks away. If I ran, he would run too. He knew where I lived. With sweaty hands, I gripped my keys tightly in my pocket. I turned the corner and, on impulse, looked over my shoulder. It was him. Marcos was just a few meters behind me, his eyes fixed on the ground, but his presence was overwhelming. Each of his steps seemed faster, more determined. My heart nearly stopped. I needed to do something. I ran toward my house, the sound of my feet echoing on the deserted street. I stumbled on the sidewalk but kept going, battling the feeling that he was getting closer and closer. When I finally reached the door, my hands shook so much that it took precious seconds to fit the key into the lock. The cold wind whipped against my face, and I felt hot breath behind me. I locked the door, and then there was silence. My breathing was heavy, my chest rising and falling rapidly. I stepped away from the door, trying to calm myself. He couldn't have followed me. Not here, not like this. But when I turned to the windows, there he was, standing on the sidewalk, looking directly at me. His face was shrouded in darkness, but I knew it was him. I could feel it. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands, ready to call the police. But before I could dial, my phone vibrated. A new message. I told you I would never leave you. I'm watching you. I dropped the phone on the floor and stepped away from the window. He knew. How did he know I was watching him? The feeling of dread washed over me, an overwhelming weight in my chest. I ran upstairs, locked all the doors, bolted the windows, but still felt exposed, vulnerable. The following days were a blur of fear and paranoia. I changed the locks, bought security cameras, and avoided going out at night. But no matter what I did, he always found a way to make me feel his presence. He knew where I was, knew when I left, even knew what I was doing inside my house. But it was the next night that everything crumbled. I was lying in bed, the absolute silence of the night interrupted by the subtle sound of wind outside. I turned from side to side but couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, every shadow seemed more threatening. Until I heard it. A noise at the door. I got up, my legs weak, and walked to the hallway. The sound was louder now, as if someone were trying to open the front door. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but before I could dial, I heard a click. The door opened. My body froze. I knew who it was. I didn't need to see to know. Slow footsteps echoed through the house. I felt panic take over me, Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was trapped in my own terror. The footsteps approached the stairs. My mind screamed for me to hide, but fear paralyzed me. And then, Marcos appeared at the top of the stairs. He didn't say a word, just watched me with those empty eyes, his face marked by fatigue and obsession. In his hand he held a knife. My gaze locked onto the cold gleam of the blade, and I knew there was no escape left. "I told you I would never leave you," he whispered, his voice low and calm. "We were made for each other, Mariana." I ran. I dashed to the bedroom and locked the door, but I knew it wouldn't matter. He started banging, each blow stronger than the last, and soon the sound of wood splintering filled my ears. I curled up in the corner, terror engulfing me completely, and then the door gave way. He entered slowly, the knife steady in his hand, his gaze fixed on me. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. He approached and, in one swift motion, grabbed me. I felt the sharp pain in my arm as he held me tight, and a damp cloth was pressed against my face. The chemical smell filled my lungs. I fought, tried to escape, but my strength faded, my vision darkening gradually. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was Marcos's face, a disturbing smile forming on his lips. When I woke up, I was in the backseat of a car, my hands tied, my mouth covered. The engine rumbled softly, and the street lights passed by the window. I knew my life would never be the same. He had taken me, and now I was trapped in his nightmare. Forever. I never imagined my life could be turned upside down so suddenly. When I met Isabel, she seemed perfect. She was the woman of my dreams, sweet, caring, intelligent. Everything about her enchanted me, from the way she looked at me to the way she smiled. I never thought that behind that smile there could be such deep and dark secrets. It all started a few weeks ago. We had been together for 3 years, married for 1, when Isabel started having strange dreams. She would wake up sweating, scared, not quite sure what she had dreamt. But her eyes, there was something in her eyes that disturbed me, something I had never seen before. The first time, I tried to calm her, holding her and saying it was just a nightmare. But the dreams didn't stop, they kept coming, night after night, as if they were trying to say something, to bring something forgotten to the surface. And then the whispers started. She would murmur things while she slept. I would sit beside her, trying to listen, but the words were always jumbled. Except for one. A name. Esther. I had never known anyone named Esther in our lives. I asked her, but Isabel always denied knowing what it meant. Yet she seemed disturbed, as if it were consuming her from the inside. Things got worse when I found an old newspaper clipping in our house. I was organizing some papers in the office when I noticed a yellowed page, folded at the bottom of a box of old memories Isabel had inherited from her grandmother. It was an old article, almost 100 years old, dated 1940. The headline read, "The Trial of Esther Rocha, the Woman Who Killed Without Mercy." In the photo, a woman sat handcuffed in the courtroom. Her eyes seemed to pierce the camera, cold and empty. And it was in that moment that the shock hit me like a punch in the stomach. The woman in the photo, she was identical to Isabel. It wasn't just a common resemblance. It was as if they were the same person. I spent the following days obsessed, researching everything I could about Esther Rocha. I found out she was a notorious serial killer, responsible for the deaths of 5 men in the 1940s. She used her charm to lure her victims before killing them in cold blood. She was convicted and executed, but the motive behind her crimes was always a mystery. Some said it was pure evil. Others spoke of a kind of madness that consumed her. And now my wife, the woman I loved, was the living image of this murderer. I tried to push the idea away, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. But then Isabel began to change. Small things in her behavior started to make me uncomfortable. She would seem distant, lost in thought. And sometimes when she didn't know I was watching, her face would take on a cold, empty expression. The same one I had seen in Esther's photo. One night, while we were having dinner, Isabel mentioned something that made me freeze. She was talking about life, death, and then she said, almost casually, "Do you believe in reincarnation?" My hands started to sweat. Cold blood ran through my veins. I looked at her, hoping it was just a random conversation, but there was something in her tone, something that unsettled me. Why are you asking that? I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. I just feel like I've lived before. Like some things are so familiar, but I don't know why. Why? She smiled, but it was a strange smile, almost as if she was hiding something. I tried to ignore it, tried to push the doubt away. But that night, as she slept beside me, I couldn't get Esther's story out of my head. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until Isabel left for work and went back to that box of memories. Inside it, I found something that would change everything. A diary. Esther's diary. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. They were detailed, dark accounts of the deaths Esther had caused. The words were cold, without remorse. But the most disturbing part was the last entry, where she wrote about reincarnation. I will return. Time cannot bind me. My soul is marked, and I will continue, century after century. Reality hit me like a punch. Isabel was Esther, the reincarnation of a murderer with no remorse. It was impossible, I knew, but at the same time, everything made sense. The name and the dreams, the strange behavior, and now this diary like a curse that had crossed through time. I sat on the floor, trying to process what I had just discovered. What should I do? Confront her. If Isabel really was Esther, who was this woman I loved? Was she the same person, or just a shadow of a terrible past? And the most frightening thought, did she know? Isabel came home late that night, and I couldn't look at her the same way. Her smile seemed fake. Her words echoed with something I could no longer understand. Inside, I was in chaos. Every time she came close, I felt fear. Fear of what she was capable of. Fear of what she might remember. The following days were a silent torture. I watched her closely, trying to find traces of Esther in her. Every gesture, every glance. I saw both women as if they were fused, living in one body. And with that came the question that tormented me. Could she kill again? It was on one of those nights when Isabel was sound asleep that I did something I never thought I would do. I got out of bed, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and approached her. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode. My mind was spinning with fear and doubt. What was I about to do? I stood there, watching her sleep, while 1,000 thoughts raced through my head. I loved Isabel, but if she truly was the reincarnation of Esther, what did that mean? And more importantly, could I accept that past? The knife trembled in my hand, and I knew I had reached a point of no return. It was now. The moment to decide. Either I accepted it, or I would end it once and for all. Isabel stirred in bed, and my heart jumped. Her eyes opened slowly, and for a second she looked at me as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. She smiled. "Is everything okay, love?" she asked, her voice soft as always. I didn't respond. I couldn't. And then she closed her eyes again, drifting back into peaceful sleep, while I stood there, frozen with the knife in my hand, trapped between two impossible choices. I never knew much about my great-uncle's side of the family. He was a distant figure, someone my parents rarely spoke of. So, when I received the news that he had died and left me his country house, everything seemed somewhat strange. It wasn't the kind of inheritance I expected, but at the same time, something inside me felt an inexplicable pull toward that place. The road to the house was long, flanked by a dense, suffocating forest. Each tree seemed to watch me, its dark shadows creeping closer as the sun began to set. When I finally arrived, I was greeted by a large, imposing house, weathered by time, but still carrying an air of somber majesty. There was something heavy in the atmosphere, a silence that seemed to pulse, almost alive. As I entered, the door creaked agonizingly, and I was met with the smell of dust and dampness. Everything was exactly as my great-uncle had left it. Furniture covered in sheets, old paintings on the walls, and an air of abandonment that gave the impression that the house had been forgotten by time. During the first few days, I explored the rooms, trying to get accustomed to the space. But it was at night that everything changed. On the second night, I woke up to a noise. Footsteps upstairs. Clear, rhythmic. They were heavy, as if someone was walking slowly, deliberately. I grabbed my phone to light the way and headed toward the stairs. As I climbed, the sound of the footsteps stopped. The feeling that I wasn't alone became unbearable. In the hallway, a door I could have sworn was closed the night before was now open. The room behind it was small and simple, except for one thing: a large mirror with a golden frame, gleaming despite the dust covering everything else. As I approached it, the air seemed to turn icy. I looked into the mirror, expecting to see only my reflection, but instead, a figure stood behind me. A man, his face twisted in pain, watching my every move. I spun around in an instant, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, he was gone. In the days that followed, the supernatural occurrences escalated. In the middle of the night, I would hear whispers seeming to come from the walls, and objects moved around while I slept. But the most disturbing thing was the mirror. Every night, it reflected something new, scenes that made no sense. Blood dripping onto the floor, bodies hanging, and always the same man from before, with that look of despair. It was only then that I began to uncover the truth. While rummaging through my great-uncle's office, I found a hidden journal, locked in a drawer. His final entries spoke of a strange visitor who appeared in the nearby village in the 1940s. No one knew where he came from, but wherever he went, people disappeared, and panic followed. What the journal revealed was shocking. My great-uncle believed this man was more than just a killer. He had the power to summon death in supernatural ways, manipulating shadows to carry out his cruel acts. And the most disturbing part, he was never found. I thought my great-uncle had become obsessed, but then I came across the final entry in his diary, in which he confessed to having trapped the spirit of this man in the mirror, using an ancient ritual he had discovered. The spirit was imprisoned there, but now something had changed. Perhaps, with my great-uncle's death, the prison had weakened. That night, the mirror revealed something even more disturbing. I wasn't just dealing with the spirit of a killer. The mirror showed the face of a woman, my grandmother. She was involved somehow. In the reflection, I saw scenes of her interacting with the man, speaking to him in secret, and then betraying him. She had been part of the pact to imprison his soul, but he never forgave her. Terror consumed me. My family was tied to him. I was tied to him. The mirror began to vibrate, and the lights in the house flickered wildly. The sound of banging echoed from upstairs, as if something were trying to break free. Desperate, I ran to the basement, where I knew there was an old iron furnace. I grabbed the mirror and, without a second thought, threw it into the fire. The glass shattered in a cacophony of cracks, and the spirit trapped inside screamed, a scream filled with agony and hatred. But something was wrong. The scream didn't stop. The shadows in the room began to move, forming indistinct figures, shapes that danced around me. The heat from the fire intensified, and I felt as if I was being pulled into the depths of the furnace. The spirit hadn't just been trapped. He was trying to take me with him. I fought against the invisible force that tried to drag me in, but at the last second, the shadows retreated. The mirror had been destroyed, but the spirit wasn't. He was free now, released from his glass prison, and he was still there, somewhere in the house, waiting, watching. That night I fled the house. I never went back. But sometimes in the stillness of the early morning, I still hear the sound of footsteps, and I know that somehow he follows me, waiting for the right moment to finish what he started decades ago. Space has always been my home, the silent vastness, a comfort that kept me far from the horrors of the past. But now I face the darkest nightmare of all, and it's not out there, in the endless void. It's inside me, and inside everyone who's ever been on this planet. We found this cursed place by accident. The planet wasn't in any records. Out of nowhere, it appeared on the radar like a shimmering jewel, surrounded by golden rings reflecting the light of the stars. Captain Rivas became obsessed the moment he saw it. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "An untouched paradise, our chance to make history." The surface glowed in colors that defied description. Everything seemed peaceful. Flowers that sparkled like stars, tall and elegant trees swaying gently in the breeze. The air was incredibly fresh. Every part of the planet felt alive and inviting, as if we had stumbled upon a secret garden in the middle of the universe. But the beauty aside, it was deceptive. "Let's set up camp," the captain ordered, as the crew began unloading the equipment from the ship. Keller, the chief scientist, was fascinated by everything around us. She collected samples of the soil and plants with a smile on her face. "This place is incredible," she whispered to me as she ran her hands through the soft earth. "This is going to change everything." I couldn't share her excitement. Something about the air bothered me, though I couldn't say what. A strange feeling, like we were being watched. I pushed the thought aside and continued my work, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease. That night, we sat around the fire. The captain, Keller Thompson, our medic, and I. The sky on that planet was indescribable, full of stars that seemed to dance across the firmament. But the silence between us was heavy. "I've never seen anything so beautiful," Thompson said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "But it doesn't feel right, you know?" The captain shot him an irritated look. "Don't start with that superstition, Thompson. We found something extraordinary. Let's take advantage of it." Thompson lowered his head, but the tension lingered in the air. We slept, or at least tried to. The next morning, Keller was acting strange. She was quiet, her gaze fixed on the trees around us. I thought she was just tired, but when I went to talk to her, something in her eyes froze me in place. "Is everything okay, Keller?" She didn't respond. Her eyes were glazed over as if she were somewhere far away. "Did you hear what I said?" She turned slowly, her lips trembling before they twisted into a sickening smile. "They're so beautiful. So perfect. Can't you see them?" A chill ran down my spine. "Keller, what are you talking about?" She walked away, completely ignoring me, heading toward the trees. I rushed to the captain, alarmed. "Captain, something's wrong with Keller." He looked at me, irritated. "You're overreacting. She just needs some rest. The place is strange, yes, but she'll be fine." But Keller wasn't fine. And Thompson, who was supposed to be taking care of her, started acting weirder by the day. 2 days passed. Keller was completely lost. She paced back and forth, laughing to herself and muttering nonsense. Thompson, on the other hand, began isolating himself, murmuring about the colors and shapes he saw in the sky. That night, everything fell apart. I woke to the sound of piercing screams. Heart racing, I rushed out of the tent. Keller was standing over Thompson, her hands drenched in blood. She had stabbed him, repeatedly. Thompson was already dead, his body lying in a pool of blood. "What have you done, Keller?" I shouted, unable to believe what I was seeing. She turned slowly, the smile still on her lips, but her eyes, they were empty. "They told me to do it. I just obeyed." The captain came running, horrified by the scene. "My God, Keller!" Before he could react, Keller lunged at him with the knife. He managed to dodge, but she was out of control. There was no trace of the kind, curious scientist we once knew. Only madness remained. I tried to intervene, but the captain was faster. He pulled out his gun and shot her. The sound of the shot echoed through the air, and Keller fell to the ground, dead. The silence that followed was unbearable. I stared at Keller's body, trying to comprehend what had just happened. "The planet, it's driving us insane," the captain muttered, his hand trembling as he holstered the gun. "We need to get out of here, now." We tried to leave, but the madness had already spread. The next morning, the captain was catatonic, mumbling incoherent words. He didn't last long. When I saw him with the gun pointed at his own head, I couldn't reach him in time. The shot echoed through the ship, and Captain Rivas collapsed to the floor, dead. Now it was just me, alone. I fled to the ship, desperately trying to escape that hell. But I couldn't pilot it by myself. We needed a crew to maneuver a ship of that size. The controls slipped through my fingers. I didn't have enough experience to break free from the orbit of that cursed planet. I stared at the controls, sweat pouring down my face. My fingers trembled, but no matter how hard I tried, I was trapped. Orbiting the planet. That beauty, that false paradise, it was responsible for everything. I knew that sooner or later, the madness would come for me too.